Okay, hello Dafydd.
Helo, shwmae?
Welcome to Aberystwyth.
Diolch yn fawr.
Um, right, we're discussing the novel Cafflogion and the adaptation, or the various adaptations which we had proposed about a year, if not longer ago, a year and 18 months ago. We were sort of working on this.
Ie.
Um, and of course, an awful lot has happened since then, which will be discussed presumably as part of the seminar. But one of the things I wanted to ask about was that in your adaptation for the film treatment, the proposal that we made for the film treatment, there was a significant shift from Cafflogion being a kind of refuge from dystopian sort of neoliberal economic efficiency and a complete collapse of any sense of community to being the result of as an ecological disaster. And so the ecological dystopian narrative got far bigger billing in the adaptation than was the
Ie.
case in the original. So could you sort of just say a little bit about the reasoning behind that?
Well, I think in the novel, there's definitely a ecological strand to the story. So what you have in the original novella that's written in 1979, so it's a some time ago, you have a group of people living in a kind of off-grid manner, contrasted to a city that's very much, I think, in the way that we might imagine cities now as well. That hasn't changed too much, being quite sort of polluted, creating all kinds of amounts of rubbish, and not being a sustainable place, really. So there's a basic contrast between those two ideas within the novel itself. So then, when thinking about adaptation, there was an awful lot of issues involved, and actually trying to drill back to kind of the main issue as to why it started is a little bit tricky by now, because it's kind of taken on its own momentum to some extent. But I think to an extent, it was seen by us, I think, as quite a cinematic book. And I was thinking to start with, there was an idea about turning it into a film, and there might be a possibility of applying for Film Cymru money to do that, and that would mean that it would need to have some kind of commercial release life. So that kind of introduced us into a kind of whole story world of commercial cinema, perhaps kind of the arty end of that, but maybe sort of some kind of slightly genre-based one, and that led us, I think, towards a kind of dystopian eco-thriller kind of genre. The seeds of that were already in that novella to some extent, but the process, the practice of adapting it, was a process of kind of trying to find things that were adaptogenic, things that would work across in a new platform. For example, a feature film platform, and then the question of transmuting things and translating certain parts of the narrative in whatever kind of level of that narrative was, whether it was action, dialogue, location, conceptual, symbolic stuff, how that would then come over in this new platform or new form of a feature film. And so, with all those kind of concepts or considerations in mind, the kind of the eco-thriller did start to dominate it a bit, and because sort of went with that to some extent.
But there's a certain kind of romance, or there's a sort of quite amenable exoticism that comes out of that as well, then, because you're pointing from this polluted, ghastly, impersonal city to a kind of perfect native paradise.
Yeah, I mean,
right on the
this
edges
is
of society.
it's a strange aspect of the novel, which still puzzles me a little bit, actually, about the kind of the motivations of main characters. And again, I think as a part of the process of adapting it, where you're kind of trying to kind of create backstories for characters and create sort of create if think about scripting exercises, typical scripting exercises around creating bits of extra narrative for characters. So what are the motivations? Where are they coming from? Where they're going to? Whose scene is it? All those kind of considerations that come into place where you're starting to kind of screenplay something. There were some difficulties in the novel's plot. Ieyan, the kind of father figure of the Cafflogion settlement, does come across a bit as he might be kind of leading a bit of a death cult. I mean, why he seems to bring disaster upon himself and on the whole enterprise that he spent most of his life trying to build. Why? We're not completely sure. There are some clues strewn around which don't quite add up to that. There's some other characters, Alan, for example, who gets sent into the city. Incredibly perilous journey to find the reporter. Why? Why are we finding a reporter? Why are we bringing somebody in from the city into the Cafflogion? It's not completely clear. Later on in the novel, Alan can't hardly operate psychologically or emotionally because he's so traumatized. So how on earth do you get into the city? There's all kinds of questions like this that are quite mysterious. And I think maybe as the son of the writer, I'm pretty close to it, and I kind of wonder whether I didn't read it in the way that I might have read it had I not been the son of the writer. I was kind of wanting to be clear. I wanted it to be explained to me, probably like all kinds of other things were explained to me by my father, rather than reading it as a piece of fiction, where some things aren't supposed to all add up. But I definitely think that this kind of first instance of the adaptation into feature film script or into a synopsis, which you might have a copy with you there of it, really shows how characters and places have been replotted so that they kind of still appear. So there's a kind of duty of care to the kind of original characters, a cast of characters, but that they work in a really different kind of set of dynamics. One of the issues was about distance and technology as well. So in the original novella from 1979, there's a helicopter ride. It just takes too long. I mean, it just wouldn't take that long. There's not enough time for the antagonist to fall asleep and then wake up again in a different kind of state. He wouldn't have time to fall asleep and wake up again in a helicopter ride from Cardiff to North Wales. So unless he's incredibly tired for some reason, but that's not explained. It's odd anyway. It wouldn't work. Yeah. So there's also technology thing about communication. So how would it be possible for us now to believe that this place could be secret? That this could be secret encampment down in the forest of North Wales that wasn't viewable from Liverpool, for example, or wasn't viewable by satellite or Google Maps or whatever. So we had to then invent as some mechanism that stopped communication, and that's where this idea of a forest that was somehow electromagnetically aware and capable of disrupting human sort of electromagnetic media signals. So that again, that was a kind of extrapolation from some of the implications in the book from the end, where they're sent off to try and start a new settlement in the forest, and also the very, very mysterious Teilhard de Chardin book, which is on the table in the last moments of Ieyan's life, seemingly sort of a key text for unlocking the mysterious motivations in the book.
Speaking of mysterious motivations, what is it like to think of this as being a work which was written by your father? Because goodness knows what goes on in the human imagination, really, and it's not. I wouldn't expect you to have a perfect biographical reading of everything that he did, and the likelihood that he would produce a dystopian science fiction novel based on how you knew him as a son, but. What is it like? Because you talked about having a certain duty to the process of adaptation, which was somewhat complicated by the fact that you're pushing around with a vision which was your father's.
Oh heck, that's a quite complicated question. But I think there's There are some elements to it so I think that hold on, stop. Dwi'n gallu ateb y cwestiwn. Rhaid i feddwl am tipyn byd. Yeah, that's a tricky one. I think what brought me to it in the first place, I think to some extent it was a kind of looking around on one level of consciousness on my part. It was looking around for a text that could be adapted, because I was really interested in the idea of adaptation. The other was in early discussions about texts that could work as films. It definitely is quite cinematic in terms of the locations it uses and the way it uses people within the landscape. So that was it was on a short list of things. Oh, that would work. But I think also this work has kind of been in the back of my mind for quite a few years, maybe because of the unresolved problems it has narratively. Perhaps that has some kind of analog to some unresolved questions one always have about their parents, the kind of a secret life they have before you can remember anything, kind of thing. And they're a kind of a key into that. And so when parents start disappearing, I think, you have these things left over that you try and find them in. Perhaps that's also part of the process. Also, I think you wrote a couple of teleplays and they were really good. Matter of Gwyddor, I remember seeing that on telly, a Matter of Principle on telly, and there's a couple of other novels by him that could be films. And I think he wanted to he was quite keen. He would quite liked to make a film of some of these books. So I'm kind of partly just carrying on what he's doing by trying to adapt it. Having said all of that, having a chat with my mum about it and talking to her about the synopsis that comes out of this process of adaptation, she kind of said, well, I think you should just write it again. It's so different that it's hardly the same thing. And I might sort of tone of voice is caricaturing her a bit there, but she was kind of slightly uneasy about it. And I think I was as well. I was uneasy about it because on one hand, we were choosing this book initially for a kind of possible film project, partly because it was considered in some ways to be kind of a bit of a Welsh classic, right? So why is it a Welsh classic? Well, it won the prose competition in the Steddfod. It was published for a period. It was on kind of syllabuses. It's reasonably well known as a book. And so if that were picked up and made into a film, it would kind of make a statement, as it were, about taking parts of contemporary or near contemporary Welsh literature and turning it into films rather than Daniel Owen or that kind of thing. So there was a kind of political reason for doing that as well. What it feels like to do it, it feels quite, there's that Harold Bloom's idea of anxiety of influence, this kind of theory, older sort of literary theory about a new poet's being paralyzed. And it feels a little bit like that because I am unsure as to whether I should make these huge, big hacking changes. And I suspect that I might have made such massive changes due to that anxiety of influence. So, if you're going to make a change, make a massive change. If you're going to have a forest that's a little bit more sort of active, make it a massive, self-aware, electromagnetic forest. So I think that there was probably an element of oversupply or making up for the fact that I was messing with his work. Don't know if that's the answer, if that makes sense as an answer.
That's good. That's compromising enough. That's good.
Yeah, like, did you get what you wanted? Yeah, pint of blood. No. But on the other hand, also it's kind of it's a way of trying to. So okay, well, I don't know. I think there is something about him as a literary figure who was liminal. So he went to public school in England. He wrote in English and in Welsh. He championed the translating between English and Welsh. and sword is a really important part of a kind of civic Welshness to be sort of operating in both languages and across them. Certainly not a evangelical anti-English language Welsh writer. So I think that also mirrors my position to a large extent, in terms of my feeling for Wales and Welshness, that is sort of a Welsh internationalist, as it were, as well as being an individual. So I think that I, not only is he my dad, but also he's a kind of kindred spirit in those beliefs, I think. So that drew me to that book. Although there's some quite interesting things in there that are anachronistic, definitely things I want to excise. For example, he sort of draws out a future Brexit in this 1979 book, where the EU is a fascist state, and by some strange mechanism, Ireland has managed not to be part of the EU and is very sort of free and happy, and Africa is the center of civilization and knowledge. And I think those are really interesting utopian ideas from the 70s, to encounter. And again, it was quite difficult decision to know what to do with those things, because you could definitely adapt them in and really have quite a different sense of what the political configurations were building from those kinds of different statements. But the weight of the realist agenda in trying to create a film script for Film Cymru in this certain way really sort of militated against doing something too radical.
Okay. Finally, I just wanted to ask what kind of perspective on all of this do you think you have now, given the fact that this is a novel which was written in Welsh, in Wales, I take it, back in the late 1970s, and reflects and is really there. It's there for a Welsh readership, because I think it reflects a lot of the kind of literary tropes which Welsh readers of that period and possibly beyond would be familiar with, and in some ways might almost expect. What is it like to look at all of that from your current perspective, about 14,000, if not more, miles away in New Zealand?
Okay. The first part of the answer to that is that the current perspective in some ways is not that different. So, for example, I'm communicating with you right now, you, Roger, and then with everybody else, hello, through this, and that this is means that it's possible to be present in a way across this distance, and for it to kind of disappear to some extent. Culturally, there are quite large similarities between Wales and New Zealand, to do with the landscape, to do with agriculture, to do with some of the kind of social values. Linguistically, there is a kind of analogy with Te Reo Maori and English, although of course I find myself on the other side of that border, if one could call it a border, a colonial border. I'm now a European white person in this country with a tiny bit of ability to speak Te Reo Maori, probably mispronounced, and feeling really awkward and not sure about how I can progress that part of myself. Should I learn it? How do I learn it? When should I use it? Where is it? It seems invisible, etc. Whereas I was, on the other side of that boundary longer. So there's some similarities and some big differences. Ecologically, and in terms of colonialism or post-colonialism, the problems and the disruptions, as it were, to a natural state, if you can use that, if you can mobilize that term, put in caveat that's a problematic term, is much younger here. So it's in living memory of people, that people were imprisoned for espousing a kind of indigenous religion, for example. It's the trees, 80% of the forest cover of the country's been cut down, but because it was until quite recently, completely covered with forest, that there's still quite a lot left. Agriculture has been here for about, modern industrial agriculture has been here for about a kind of 100 years. Before then, you had a very different kind of agriculture, but that kind of culture and that knowledge is still just about retrievable. Whereas I think my feeling in Wales is going to be a bit controversial, was that to retrieve it, you have to do a kind of Gwilym Morris kind of excavation right back into pre-Roman period to try and find out when there was something that you could call indigenous to the country that wasn't, as it were, colonized. So some of the stuff around the ecology and some of the stuff around the split between the city and the country maybe comes into even sharper relief here than it did in Wales. It's a long answer to that question. I'm not even sure about quite a lot of what I just said there, but some of those issues are sharpened because of that similarity and yet flippedness.
It's interesting because one thing you haven't mentioned there at all is sort of any kind of problem about belonging, and I think in a way Cafflogion the novel has got far more in it about a sort of yearning for a kind of return to a communitarian based place than anything that you've sort of mentioned now. In a way, you could say that through media such as this, then you can still fabricate a kind of sense of community regardless of the geographical distance. But really Cafflogion is about it's kind of nostalgia for a simpler way of life, or a simpler place, and one that promotes and preserves as a basic principle the idea of being together. I think maybe one of the drivers of the novel, it feels as if it's the sense that is kind of already lost. Your dad seems more of an exile than you are.
Yes. Yeah, well, he was in exile. I think he was in exile, and I think his earlier fiction, Gwared y Gwirion, etc., talks about that process of exiling from Penllyn, and for him, Penllyn then became a kind of romanticized or even disembodied place of origin that he drew on imaginatively in lots of his work and in his living day-to-day life, I think. I probably do I draw on Aberystwyth in the same way? I probably do, this conversation is kind of, testament to that. And this project is to some extent. In sense of belonging, in terms of communitarian values, it feels here very similar to Aber. I mean, I'm living next door to on the outskirts of a city. There's 1 million plus people, so it's quite a bit bigger than Aberystwyth, a bit bigger than cities in Wales. And it's got sort of massive international airport and large immigrant communities. 20% of the population of Auckland's either from China or India. So you've got this kind of melting pot, as it were, cultural melting pot just next door. And maybe this isn't a sound thing to say. And the communitarian values seem very traditional and strong here. So it doesn't feel like an atomized situation. It feels very communitarian. And that, I'm rambling here. Right? Rhaid fi ddechrau eto felly. Mae hwn yn fi eitha anodd disgrifio be fi'n trio gweud. A ddechrau eto. In terms of communitarian stuff, here is actually quite similar, I think, to Wales. There's a sense of community and the importance of community, how it operates. And at the same time, there is a clear problem about how communities operate. So people live that tension, I think. And that's similar to Aber, and I think quite similar to Cafflogion. But in Cafflogion, there's, as you say, a nostalgia and yearning for a community in the face of the kind of atomization of the city. I think that's definitely present here as well. And it's kind of one of the big issues of the world, isn't it, at the moment? There's this kind of disjuncture from where you belong, and a seeming fleeting possibility of being able to recreate it in different ways. And also the discussion about the importance of it. I mean, does it matter? There is a kind of argument to say that if it really, really matters that you live on your Milltir Sgwâr, because of a kind of energetic, sort of like some kind of mystical energy connection, or a language connection, or a community connection, or a connection of your genealogy. And if you cut those cords, then you are basically sort of damaged in a way. Then that a heck of a lot of people in the world are in that state at the moment. So I think that question about indigeneity and an essential relationship with a bit of land is really a difficult area to navigate oneself in. I think I used to feel that about Aberystwyth, but on the other hand, I also kind of felt that at times the duty of it quite heavily weighed upon you. So if you move to somewhere else like this, those things disappear. Those lines of duties aren't there. You're sort of in a way free, although you're also kind of a bit empty. What's interesting here is to be next to be experiencing that in a situation where other people are battling for land rights in a very similar way to Dal dy Dir, Maori, fighting for battle rights. So that's a bit similar to the kind of thing I was saying earlier about being on the other side of a kind of colonial experience. Dwi'n yn gwybod os oedd hwnna'n neud lot o sens, really, ond mae hwnna'n effach o gwestiwn anodd i ateb, fi'n credu.
Odi. OK, good. Diolch yn fawr.
Os yna rhywbeth arall i weid? Ti eisiau rhywbeth arall?